with us. Dr. Posen, when you look at the commodity currencies, we come out of this recovery. Is it commodities the future here? Do we need to pay more attention to those commodity nations than we are now?
You can't pay more attention to them because what is truly a commodity nation like a Canada or an Australia are embodied by their commodities. And so the commodity market tells you all you need to know, in a sense. There are much more large, complicated economies like Brazil that have commodity components. But for most of these countries, the commodity market tells you what you need to know. The other piece of it is you got to separate out the commodity markets into three components. There's industrial materials and food. There's oil and energy, and there's gold. Industrial materials and food is very cyclical, so what you were implying, Tom, that's what we're looking at going up. Food on that same category. Energy, big swings, a little more confusing. Gold, anybody who's long gold from here is going to be probably pretty unhappy, I think.
Richard Claret has been eloquent about talking about not a lower potential GDP. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but Adam Posen, Alan Blinder has been forceful at Princeton about not agreeing with the new normal. He has said, look, we're going to come out of this. We are going to get back to a not robust, but at least a healthy potential GDP. In Nehru, the unemployment rate will work its way down to some new level. Where are you within this polarity between Blinder and L. Arian? Where does Adam Posen fit in your study?
I regret to say I'm more in the L. Arian Clarida kind of camp and not with Alan Blinder. I like them both, but unfortunately I think the bad news is true.
The American Enterprise Association, American Economic Association meetings, everybody loves everybody, and then you fight like cats and dogs for 3 days.
No. There are plenty of ones I hate, but Blinder, L. Arian, these are the good guys. But leaving that aside, fair point, Tom, but let's sticking with the potential
Please.
Issue. We know, and I've said this on your program when you guys were merely doing radio, we know the potential was slowing down in the U.S. even before the financial crisis. The rate of labor force growth had slowed. We've stopped adding as many immigrants, and we've reached a temporary high in how many women we're adding because of just demographics. More importantly, productivity slowed down. We had the sudden burst of productivity in the last quarter's data, but that's totally driven by labor shedding. That's not a sustainable thing. So you're looking at a slower rate of productivity growth going forward, even before the crisis. Then you throw in the fact there's got to be some crowding out of useful investment between the credit crunch and then the run-up of government debt. And there's probably some misallocation of capital as a result of the financial sector. It's hard for me to see how we just sort of fully bounce back. I think we're looking at a potential growth rate, somewhere between 2 and 2.5 as opposed to around 3.5 where we were a few years ago.
Well, Professor Clarida, if we talk about the PIMCO view of growth, it's going to be pretty slow for the foreseeable future. Does that also mean interest rates will stay about where they are?
Well, there are two very powerful forces on interest rates that are moving in exactly opposite directions. So you've got a sluggish economy, and agree with Adam, potential growth is closer to 2 than 3. I also don't see a V-shaped recovery, and that would tend to keep rates low. The Fed on hold for extended considerable period, pick your favorite adjective. On the other hand, you've got this mountain of Treasury supply, $2 trillion of Treasuries hitting the market this year, nearly that amount the next year. Even 3 or 4 years out, the CBO is looking at a $1 trillion Treasury issuance. In addition, if you get a rebound in the global economy, which we're seeing, they'll be less inclined to park their reserves in Treasury. So you have these two very powerful forces, and that means from our view, interest rates are essentially in a range right now. We don't see a big move up. We don't see a big move down in the near term. But in terms of the way we're focused on allocating capital, it's not directly on making big bets on where rates are going.
Rich, do you have a question for Adam?
Adam, what I'd like to find out is, obviously thrilled with a new appointment. I'd like you to, instead of looking ahead the next 3 months or the next 6 months, look ahead 3 years and tell us where you think the UK and the financial system is going to be in terms of central bank independence, the role of central banks in propping up credit markets. The predicate for this is, of course, as I like to remind people, World War II ended in 1945, right, and the Fed was still in the business of pegging interest rates 6 years later. So where are we going to be in 3 years?
No, Rich, you're absolutely right. And I think the important thing people forget is that central bank independence can be on paper, but it depends a lot on your political context. The example you're giving, Rich, that the so-called Treasury-Fed Accord that lasted not just through wartime but constrained the Fed for years after took place in an environment not just where there was a lot of debt issuance, but the other thing that happened was the Fed was perceived as having really dropped the ball and messed up in the 30s. And so the interesting question for the Fed or the Bank of England or any democratic central bank in a democratic republic from here is, are they seen as to blame for the crisis, or are they seen as having done the best they could? And obviously the truth's somewhere in between. But the more it's seen as the Fed or the Bank of England or the ECB is to blame on the regulatory side as well as the monetary side, the less independence in practice they're going to have going forward. Now, I think that while there's a lot of blame to go around on the regulatory side, at least the monetary side, the central banks have done largely right. And I think people recognize that. And that's reflected, you talked about the PIMCO view, your view on interest rates. That's reflected in the good anchoring of inflation expectations that keeps the interest rate stable. So in a sense, wherever else has happened, the central banks have delivered on their core mandate. 3 years down the road, what I think we may see in a number of countries, and I've written about this before, is something of a repeat of Volcker-Reagan, where you're going to see, not now, not this year, but you're going to see central banks having to start tightening ahead of when governments get their fiscal houses in order.
Yeah.
And that is a conflict. And I think in the end, it probably promotes central bank independence the way it did under Volcker, but it makes for a bumpy ride. I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Do you have 30 seconds here to squeeze that in there? Do we have a tension between monetary and fiscal policy?
Two very powerful forces, and Adam laid it out very well. You've got fiscal deficits which push up rates, you've got a weak economy, and anchored inflation expectations that keep them down. It's that tug of war that's going to make investing interesting over the next 3 years.
It's a tug of war. It's going to keep Ken and I in business. Adam Posen, thank you so much, with the Peterson Institute and, of course, member of the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee.